Welcome everybody to GoLocal Live. I'm Josh Fenton, CEO and co-founder. Joining us this morning is Jennifer Lawless. She's the chair of the Political Science Department at the University of Virginia. Professor, thanks for joining us.
Very exciting day.
Very exciting day. Today is debate preview here at GoLocal, so I want to jump into it. I've seen the CNN preview of how the format works and the shutting off of the mics of the person not who's under the question in the situation. Talk about the format and who do you think this gives the advantage to?
Well, the format is pretty straightforward. Before we get to the mic situation, each candidate will have 2 minutes to answer a question and then 1 minute for the other candidate to rebut. And then if there's reason, the moderator can then allow the original candidate 1 more minute to counter rebut. So that's pretty standard. What's not standard is that the default position is going to be that whoever is not speaking will have their microphone turned off. That means that if they interrupt, it just basically sounds like garble behind the scenes, and people might hear a little bit of it, but they won't be able to make out what it sounds like, what it's actually saying, what the words are. So initially, I think a lot of people thought this would help the Biden campaign. It was a request of the Biden campaign because in 2020, Donald Trump interrupted him so much, it was difficult for him to make his point. But in retrospect, I think a lot of people on the Biden side are now questioning whether this is actually an advantage for Joe Biden, because when Donald Trump is forced to behave, he seems a lot more mainstream and normal than the Democrats want him to seem. And this is basically going to require that he do that. Ultimately, though, it'll come down to whether Jake Tapper and Dana Bash enforce the rules or whether they leave the microphones on.
But isn't there another X factor, which is it'll be amazingly distracting if President Biden is giving a response to a question and Donald Trump, the former president, is then talking but can't be heard, right? So he's going to be animated and shaking his head and no, that's not right, and potentially making bunny ears or things like that. Doesn't that actually shifts it over to Donald Trump continuing to be the center of attention de facto?
Well, I mean, it depends whether Donald Trump thinks that there's an incentive for him to just try and get Joe Biden off his game by interrupting him in a way that only Biden can hear. And so that becomes a factor. The other thing is, unlike most debates, these podiums are pretty close together. They're only 8 feet apart. And so it's likely that for most questions, voters will see both candidates, not necessarily even in a split screen. They might actually see them both in one screen. That creates an incentive, obviously, for Donald Trump to be somewhat disruptive physically as opposed to verbally. But again, we'll see. I don't know. I think there are a lot of unknowns regarding the microphone situation and regarding the placement of the podiums.
But because they have podiums and they are 8 feet away, it doesn't have the effect of Donald Trump sort of swirling behind Hillary Clinton in the 2016 debate, in which every time she was answering a question, he would sort of lurk behind her in sort of this creepy, ominous way, but it was very effective to disrupt her and make her very uneasy from a physical standpoint.
That's true, although remember in 2008 when John McCain was debating Barack Obama and they had that space on the stage and John McCain just looked like he was wandering around. And so that actually helped Barack Obama because it looked like there was this old guy who didn't know where he was roaming the stage. So I think there are pros and cons to all of the setups. The one thing that I will say that's kind of interesting about the podium situation is that you can still be pretty disruptive. We can think back to the 2000 debate where Al Gore's sighing and flopping himself on the front of the podium sort of in distress, didn't play that well for him and did help George W. Bush. So, I think there are pros and cons regardless of the actual setup.
It also lends itself to an analogy of Horseshack on Welcome Back Carter raising his hands and screaming, ooh, Mr. Carter, Mr. Carter. I just have some idea that something like that may happen. Let's talk about gaffes.
Wait, by the way, the fact that everybody watching the debate will be at least 70 years old means that your reference will be appreciated.
Let's talk about gaffes. I don't know who's going to be watching because the 9 o'clock debate is going to kill off. There's going to be a lot of people snoozing in their lazy boys. But let's talk about gaffes. Obviously, the most impactful gaffe was the 1980 presidential debate between Jimmy Carter and Gerald Ford. Max Frankel asked the question about sort of the influence of the USSR over Eastern Europe. Gerald Ford blunders the question. Frankel follows up, sort of trying to give him a lifeline and sort of says, are you sure that's the answer to this question, that Eastern Europe is not under Soviet control? And Ford doubles down on it. It is mind-boggling. I watched it again this morning. It is so almost impossible that Gerald Ford gave the response the first time and then doubled down the second time. Are we going to have, we have a 78-year-old and an 81-year-old. Are we going to have one of those types of gaffes this evening?
I don't think so. The Biden campaign has already said that we should expect no new news in terms of policy, personnel, or big proposals. They're basically just going to focus on what Joe Biden has done and differentiate Biden from Trump in terms of character. So I don't think the Biden campaign wants to make any news. They just want to demonstrate that he can be energetic for 90 minutes and get through this. I think it'll be a lot of the same kinds of lines that we saw in the State of the Union address. On the Trump side of things, it's difficult to call anything that he says a gaffe anymore because he's not held to the same standards as other politicians have been. There's this general acceptance that he just says whatever he thinks, and then the next day he can take it all back, and he's not held accountable for it. So I don't know if we're at a time where there's a possible way for Donald Trump to make a gaffe. The other thing that I would note is it's not only incorrect information that turns out to be problematic. We can all think back to the 1988 presidential debate where Bernard Shaw asked Michael Dukakis, who was notoriously opposed to the death penalty, whether he would support the death penalty if his wife were raped and murdered. And he answered like a robot. Instead of saying, oh my gosh, that would be a terrible thing, he said, no, I still would not do that. And his follow-up to that question also demonstrated this technocratic response that reinforced people's concerns that he just lacked a general sense of empathy. So it's not only on the substance, it's also on the style that debates can either reinforce or undermine something that a candidate is trying to portray.
Let me just go back to one factor. Yes, it's all about playing against expectations. So Donald Trump may make false statements, but nobody expects anything different. Is the problem then for Joe Biden that if he gives an incorrect answer, he looks like he is aged out, that he is out of it?
That's definitely a risk, yes. Now, the other thing that's kind of interesting, though, is that according to the New York Times Siena poll this morning, a majority of people believe that Donald Trump will win the debate. So expectations for Joe Biden are quite low, despite the fact that the Biden campaign has said all week that they've been practicing quite a bit, and the Trump campaign, I think, is lying and saying that Donald Trump is going to not prepare at all for the debate. But the reality is that it is about exceeding expectations, and the expectations for Biden are, pretty much on the ground. So one mistake, two mistakes might not be as damning as if they had been coming from somebody who was expected to give an amazing debate performance.
Okay, let's talk about age versus aggression. I think if you're in the Biden camp, you want to make sure that your candidate looks with it, that he's cognitively performing well. And on the other side, bless you, on the other side, on the Trump side, you're just hoping and praying he does not go ballistic. So on those two factors, where do you think that each of these presidential candidates and presidents will perform?
Well, we've seen Joe Biden, when he needs to be, demonstrate that he does have the stamina and the wherewithal to be president. We have not seen Donald Trump demonstrate the level of discipline that is required tonight. So if I had to put money on which candidate would blow it, I would probably say that Donald Trump would. But I don't know that there are any consequences to Donald Trump blowing it. So if there are no consequences, have you blown it?
So let's talk about the CNN factor, right? Here's this network that is both hosting it and broadcasting it, and only their hosts are moderating this, Dana Bash and Jack Taper. And both of them have a tendency to interrupt Trump spokespeople to correct the record. Are they going to be inserting themselves on factual, false statements by Trump? And if so, what's the impact of that?
I don't think they'll be interrupting him during his responses. I can imagine that they will correct information in real time as soon as that response is finished. And that's going to make Donald Trump crazy. Now, he's already indicated that he thinks that this is a Democratic debate, that he thinks that Dana Bash and Jake Tapper are already in Biden's pocket, that this is completely not fair. I think he's referred to it as a fake debate already, despite the fact that he and his team agreed to the terms, agreed to the network, agreed to the moderators, and agreed to the setup. But he has spent the last week pretty much preparing everybody for what he is likely going to argue was an unfair media establishment taking him
down. Jake Tapper can be aggressive, Dana Bash a little more reserved. Does that run a risk of it being a perception of, and for the viewer as well, that it's sort of a gang up against President Trump? And was it brilliant for them, the Trump campaign, to agree to this first debate being on CNN, so that whatever the outcome, they could always claim it was a gang up?
Well, I think that CNN and Bash and Tapper in particular are well aware that that could be the perception. So I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of the questions, certainly at the beginning, are questions that are not fact-based, right? They can be questions about Donald Trump's 34 felony convictions and what he thinks about them and whether he thinks that qualifies somebody to be president. These do not have to be questions about, what the level of inflation is or what the level of unemployment is or what it was when he left office versus now. That's not to say that those things won't come up. They will, and they'll likely come up pretty early on. But my bet is that the beginning sets of questions will be questions where they are not in a position to correct him because it's just his perception of the world. The other thing that I would note is that my bet is that early on, they're going to give both candidates quite a bit of rope to try and goad the other one into doing something that's a little bit unhinged. I mean, I can imagine questions about all of the trials and the 34 convictions, and Trump obviously relating this back to a two-tiered system of justice and Hunter Biden, hoping that Joe Biden will take the bait and say something, about his son that Trump is then going to be able to use to tie him to the Biden crime family language that he always uses. So, I think that at least early on, Jake Tapper and Dana Bash can probably just sit back and watch the two of them fight it out.
We've talked about gaffes, obviously maybe the greatest single line. It's been replayed a lot this week, and I remember it. And it ended the 1984 election. Ronald Reagan had a terrible first debate, looked old, meandered, couldn't answer questions. The second debate, right out of the box against former Vice President Walter Mondale, he delivers the line about age and experience, flips the whole issue around on Mondale. And the greatest part of that segment is Walter Mondale laughing at Reagan's joke and functionally saying, "I am done for right here and now. I have lost the election." Are either one of these two candidates capable of that sort of endearing moment? We talk about the gaffes and the negativisms and the harsh tactics. Are either one of them potentially able to do something that might actually be perceived as likable?
I think Joe Biden's very likable. I think most people like him. I just don't think that Donald Trump gives him an opportunity on this stage to demonstrate any sort of interpersonal exchange between them in a likable way, because Donald Trump has no sense of humor. And I say that objectively, right? Like, when was the last time we've seen Donald Trump laugh or poke fun at himself? Like, he just doesn't do that. He's not at all self-deprecating. And so those kinds of moments require a level of humor and personality that Donald Trump just doesn't have. It hasn't hurt him that he hasn't had it, but that makes it difficult, I think, for Joe Biden to engage in a way that voters might find appealing. Now, Joe Biden can look directly at the microphone and make that case to the American people. And in 2020, at one point, I do remember him looking directly to the camera and saying, "People, like, this guy's a clown," right? And that was this sort of like endearing moment. Like, are you listening to this guy? So I wouldn't be surprised if we see some of that, but I doubt that it will be between the two of them. I'm also interested to see if there's an actual handshake at the beginning or if they both just come out and stand behind their podiums.
And if they do handshake, will it be one of those machismo handshakes where they try and pull the other one off balance, or
arm wrestling?
Death grip, yeah, or at least thumb wrestle, if nothing else. we're going to do a follow-up tomorrow at the same time, 11 o'clock. Is there going to be a clear winner or loser? Is your prediction that there will be a clear winner or loser coming out of tonight?
I think probably. My prediction is that Joe Biden will meet and exceed expectations in terms of showing up and being articulate and being energetic for 90 minutes, and that will probably give him an edge. And I also think it's likely that Donald Trump will say something or demonstrate something to suggest that he's petty or tyrannical or, a little bit petulant, and that'll work to his disadvantage. But the one thing I would note is, at the end of the day, we're several months out from the election. And so unless something very, very strange happens that has the potential to go viral and has several months of staying power, this isn't going to matter that much. And the other thing that I would note is, despite the fact that 60% of people say they plan to watch the debate, we could very well be in for one of the lowest rated debates of all time. So we'll see.
Well, and isn't the likelihood that between 9:30, quarter of 10, there will be pretty good audience, but by 10:15, 10:30, Taper and Mash might be the only two still paying attention?
Well, that's why I think the good questions are going to be at the beginning. They want to hook their audience. There is a commercial break, and they want to hook the audience. They also want to create incentives for all of the other networks that are planning on airing the debate to continue to do so post-commercial break. So CNN is walking this fine line in that they achieved a media coup in getting this. But the question now is, are they going to be able to deliver and make it important and lucrative? And there, I'm not so sure.
Your final thoughts. We'll be back tomorrow at 11 o'clock, giving the post-game analysis and maybe a little analysis of the claims of analysis that take place later tonight and into the morning from the national media. But your prediction, what your thoughts are, and a couple thoughts about those who, for those who are watching, and what they should look for.
On a personal level, I'm incredibly nervous. I feel like the two of them have demonstrated multiple times that they go off script in a way that's a little bit cringy. And so I'm a little worried about what both sides could potentially do. But I would say that the two big issues to sort of watch for are, first, the extent to which they just completely talk over each other. Donald Trump has every incentive to make this about the economy and immigration, and Joe Biden has every incentive to make this about the future of democracy and abortion. And the question will be whether they're just really trying to shore up enthusiasm among their own bases and not even discussing any of these issues with each other, or whether this far out they're trying to win over independents and some swing voters. The second thing that I would really be on the lookout for is whether Donald Trump says anything that would suggest that he is going to punish his political rivals if he gets elected. Because the minute he says anything to suggest that, you can bet that Biden is going to seize on it, because the Democrats have a major advantage when it comes to questions of democratic principles. So those would be the two sets of issues I'd be looking at.
Yeah, I have only one piece of analysis. All I can think of is those two Muppet characters, the elderly gentleman up in the balcony muttering to each other and to themselves, just kind of nonstop and having no value. And that's unfortunately, our democracy has somewhat failed this cycle of who our candidates are and what our options are. But we'll see.
One final thought. We know that Donald Trump likes to attack moderators, and I'll also be interested in the gender dynamics of those attacks. He took a lot of heat for attacking Megyn Kelly years ago in a 2015 primary debate, I believe, using completely gendered language. That's not to say that he doesn't attack male moderators, but he does it differently. And so I'll also be interested to see whether he goes after Jake Tapper or Dana Bash more, and the way in which he does it.
Everybody stay tuned tonight. Professor Lawless, thank you as always. We will be back tomorrow on Friday at 11 o'clock on GoLocal Live, talking about these same issues and the analysis of what takes place tonight. Donald Trump and Joe Biden, the first time a former president and a sitting president have debated one another. This is historic, and hopefully it's in the best interest of the country. Stay tuned, everybody, for much more. GoLocal's working on a significant story about a alleged effort to hit two federal prosecutors. Kate Nagel will have that up shortly. and we'll have much more. It's a beautiful day. Enjoy everything. Thanks, everybody.